Hey everyone, this is Pete, and welcome back to Atari A to Z, a series of short playthroughs of Atari 8-bit games, some which I grew up with and some which are new to me. Today's game is Kaboom, which was originally a 1981 release for Atari 2600 by Activision, developed by Larry Kaplan. Now, Kaboom is an unofficial, unauthorised adaptation of Atari's 1978 arcade game Avalanche that we've previously seen on the Atari A to Z flashback series. But the rows of rocks at the top of the screen in Avalanche were replaced by a single Mad Bomber sprite that moved left and right, just to make life a little bit easier for the poor old 2600. Kaboom sold over 1 million copies on Atari 2600 between 1981 and 1983, at which point it was ported to Atari 8-bit and Atari 5200. And the Atari 8-bit version is actually the version I'm a little bit more familiar with, because that's the one that I actually grew up with. I didn't play the 2600 version until later. And they're pretty similar, but there's a few differences that are quite interesting to look at. So let's go play Kaboom.
Okay, here we are with Kaboom, conceived and designed by Larry Kaplan, who you may recall from some earlier episodes of Atari A to Z Flashback, is someone who worked at Atari during the early days of the Atari 2600, and then went on to be one of the founding members of Activision, largely in frustration at Atari's early policy of not actually crediting the people who worked on their games, the people who designed their games, the programmers, the graphic artists. Well, it was generally mostly done by one person at the time, but so Activision always made a point of crediting the people behind their games, including the people who converted them to other platforms, such as in this case. And that was a big deal at the time. Yeah, you might not think much of it now, given how long credit sequences are in your average game these days, but it was a huge deal at the time. Anyway, Kaboom, many of you may well be familiar with it already, but the Atari 2600 version is a little bit more well known. This is the Atari 8-bit version. There's not a ton of differences, but there's enough to make it worth looking at. One thing worth considering in this one is the fact that you've got the option of playing with either a paddle or a joystick. Now, I don't have a paddle to hand, so we're going to play with joystick for now. If you hit the select button, there's also various options for two-player modes as well. We're just playing solo for today. Pitch and catch, I believe, is a mode where I think the other player controls the Mad Bomber. I think. I can't remember offhand. We don't have a means of testing it right now, unfortunately. But the option is there. So you can either take it in turns to try and catch as many bombs as you can, or you can compete against one another, which is nice. But yeah, we're just going to play with one player for now, and we're going to play with the joystick rather than a paddle, which is probably not the optimal way to play Kaboom, but it's all we got for the minute. So let's go. So we begin. The Mad Bomber is ready to drop, and we hit the fire button, and off we go. So on the off chance you've not come across Kaboom before, the aim is pretty simple. You have these buckets of water at the bottom, and it's your job to catch all the bombs that the Mad Bomber is dropping on you. And with each passing phase, he gets a bit faster and his movements get more erratic. So the joystick controls, joystick controls aren't that bad. The main advantage of paddle controls is how quickly you can respond. But the nice thing about the joystick controls in this is that they are very responsive and the movement is very quick. So you're not really put at a disadvantage in terms of how quickly you can move across the screen. Plus, some people just find it a little bit easier to play with the joystick anyway. Or some people don't have the option to play with paddles. I know that when I grew up with my Atari 8-bit, we didn't have paddle controllers. So when I played Kaboom, my only option was to play with joystick. You know, I've actually still never played with a real paddle controller. The closest I've come is the sort of simulated paddle controls in Atari Flashback Classics, which are obviously not a patch on the real thing. But I know that Atari 2600 enthusiasts absolutely swear by paddle controllers. They're certainly an all-time favourite controller of a lot of people, just due to their responsiveness and their flexibility, and the fact that because they came in pairs, because they came in pairs, you could have up to 4-player games with them as well, using just 2 joystick ports, which was definitely a big selling point. Yeah, this is tricky. This game actually used to frighten me when I was a kid, because like I found the face of the Mad Bomber quite intimidating, and I didn't like sort of the sudden explosions and so on. It used to make me jump, and I didn't like things that made me jump when I was a kid. But it's nice that the high score table records whether you're using joystick or paddle. So if you do happen to have access to both, you can sort of compare your performance with both. That's quite fun. Let's have another go. So the music you can hear in the background is an addition to this version. That was not in the Atari 2600 version, and that's putting the additional sound channels of the Atari 8-bit to work. So the Atari 2600 had, I think it was 2 sound channels, whereas the Atari 8-bit has 4. And so it's free to do more complex things with sound. More things going on at the same time. Oh, God. Whew. Yeah, as the pace of the bombs falling accelerates, the speed of your buckets increases as well. So even if you're using joystick, you can always keep up with the pace of the game. Assuming you're skilled enough to handle it, that is. This is an interesting game. I mean, it looks really simple. But the more you play it, the more you notice that there's sort of a really interesting rhythm to it, I guess you might call it. In that... So yeah, these slow ones are really easy, and you can look at just actually catching them directly. But the faster it goes, the more it becomes about sort of following a path that's drawn out on the screen, rather than trying to catch each individual bomb. So in some senses, you can actually sort of relate this to things like modern rhythm games. Because although you're not tapping a button rhythmically in this, you are basically following a chart which tells you where to move. And I guess in this version you are effectively playing a piece of music while you're playing the game as well. It's interesting, especially when you consider that many years later Activision would be the ones to publish Guitar Hero. But yeah, this is an all-time classic just because it's simple and accessible, but it's really challenging. So, as you can see, even getting over 1,000 points is a significant challenge in this game. Don't know if are there any other options we can use. We've got select to change You can have smaller buckets as well, but there's no option to like start on a later level or anything like that. I'm not going to try the smaller buckets version because I'm already fairly incompetent in this game, but let's have a few more goes anyway, because I'm enjoying myself. Not 100% sure what the 1 is down at the bottom of the screen. I assumed like stage or something, but it doesn't seem to advance, or maybe I'm just not good enough to advance to the next stage. And if you watch the score at the top, you'll see that it uses sort of Activision's standard scoring system that they use for a lot of their games, which is that each increase in difficulty brings with it an increase in points. So you start gaining just 1 point, and each time it gets harder, you get more points. So the longer you survive in the game, the amount of points you'll gain grows considerably. So once you manage to bypass a sort of particular level of difficulty, you'll find that your score grows a lot more dramatically than it does in the early... Oh, God! Than it does in the early stages of the game. And this is quite common practice in arcade games of the era. Because it gave your score a certain amount of meaning. So it meant that there was a significant difference between people who were good at the game and people who were just getting started with it. And it's also inherently satisfying for the player as well. So as you continue through the game, you see your score going up more and more quickly. That's a very satisfying thing to see. Oh, that was dumb. Yeah, so I tend to find while playing this game, the best way of thinking of it when you get to the faster stages is rather than trying to catch the bombs, you're just trying to move through them, really. Because if you try and look at them all individually, then you're on a pretty sure route to disaster. And again, that's quite a sort of link with music again, because as any sort of musician with any degree of experience will tell you, when you're reading music, you're not really reading the individual notes for the most part. You're recognizing patterns and being able to apply those patterns to things that you need to do with your instrument. And that exact thing that you need to do with your instrument varies according to what instrument it is, but the principle is the same. You're sort of looking at the overall pattern of things and the shape of things rather than each individual component of it. And by the time you get to sort of this point in the game, that's pretty much what you're doing here. I have such an itchy nose today, I do apologise. I also find it's easy to develop a bit of a mental block when you lose just one of those buckets at the bottom. I don't think it actually changes how accurate you need to be or anything like that, but just not having that bucket there to look at makes it feel like it's more difficult to catch a thing. So if you see, I can technically catch one of the bombs when it's underneath that second bucket, but it just feels a little bit harder to judge when you're doing that. Again, yeah, I must confess, I was never a huge fan of this when I was a kid, largely because of the fact it scared me. But I've really come to appreciate it over the subsequent years. And there have been a bunch of ways to revisit this game over the years as well. It's been in the various Activision anthology collections on various platforms like the PS2 and the PSP and such like. I think it might have been on the Microsoft Game Room service. I forget. There were certainly some Activision games on there because I remember playing River Raid a lot and actually getting very close to the top of the worldwide leaderboard at one point. RIP Game Room. Yeah, this is one that I'm surprised sort of hasn't been resurrected for like a modern day downloadable version for consoles or something like that, are they? I kind of think like this is one of those games that if you update it too much, it will lose some of that simplistic charm. Activision is long overdue a re-release of their 2600 titles. Because they haven't done one since the... what is it? 6th generation? PS2, PSP and that lot. And with such enthusiasm for retro gaming as there is right now, for various reasons, I think they're ripe for a re-release. I would particularly love to see an Activision anthology collection for the Evercade. Just because that platform is already so great for this era of gaming and up to the 16-bit era. A cartridge that just had all of Activision's classic 2600 games on it would just be fantastic. I don't need the extras that were in Activision Anthology. I mean, those were cool. It was fun to see the adverts and to sort of get virtual versions of the patches that you could send off to Activision for back in the day. Which, if you're not familiar, each Activision game had, I guess you'd call it a competition of sorts, but what would happen is they'd set you a challenge in the game's manual, usually attaining a particular score, and you'd have to take a photograph of your TV as proof that you'd achieved the challenge, scored the particular number of points, or reached a particular level, or whatever. And if you did, they would send you a fabric patch that you could stitch onto your clothing, or pin up on your wall, or whatever. And that's the idea, was over time you'd gradually build up this collection of Activision patches, sort of demonstrating your mad gamer skills to all and sundry. I guess it was essentially the precursor to achievements. Oh god, it's so fast. It's so fast. It's so fast. Yeah, it was essentially achievements, except you got tangible, actual, physical rewards for accomplishing particular goals. Which is really cool. I have one more go, because I've been going nearly 20 minutes on this already. I was concerned that this game was going to be too simple for me to talk about for very long, but it turns out there's been plenty to talk about. Anyway, this is the last go. Let's make it a good one. Concentrating. Deep in concentration. But yeah, sadly, I don't... To be honest, I'd be very surprised if we do see another Activision anthology on any platform, really, because the Activision of today seems completely uninterested in its history. Which is a real shame. Because they got some real gems in their library, and just acknowledging some of those retro classics would go a long way to sort of dispelling the reputation they have as the Call of Duty people. Which, I mean, regardless of your own personal feelings about Call of Duty, there's a significant proportion of gaming enthusiasts who see that as a negative thing. Oh, you get an extra bucket at 1,000 points. That's what that noise is. Yeah, I just think sort of bothering to acknowledge their past would go a long way to sort of rebuilding a bit of trust that they've lost over the years with a lot of people, particularly people who were there for them right at the beginning. And I don't think I've played an Activision game for a very long time. I think technically the last Activision game I played was probably a Blizzard game, which I kind of feel doesn't really count. But anyway, that's a whole other discussion. That was Kaboom for Atari 8-bit. It's a very good version of a very good game. So yeah, check it out. And if you can't check it out on the Atari 8-bit for whatever reason, try and track down the 2600 version via one means or another. However you play it, play Kaboom. As always, thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you again next time.